Burkina Faso commemorated the 34th anniversary of the death of former President Thomas Sankara. Sankara was assassinated on October the 15th in 1987, along with 12 of his comrades. He had been in power for 4 years. He was only 37 years old at the time of his death and had accomplished quite a lot. His close friend and successor, Blaise Compaoré, is among 14 people who will reappear in court on October 25th following a postponement last week. Africa has been plagued by a series of military takeovers, coups and civil protests in recent years. We are joined now to speak about how coups have grown on the continent, or whether they're resurging rather. We are joined by Dr. David Zounmenou of the Institute for Security Studies. They held a seminar this week on this particular subject. Thank you very much, Dr. David, for your time this afternoon. Let's start with the basic understanding of what a coup is.
Well, a coup is a change of government that takes place out of the constitutional norms. It has some clandestinity element and becomes effective when it's directed against the government and effectively put an end to it. There is also a military element that's associated with the coup. So generally what happens is a decision by the group of military officers who plan clandestinely to use the gun to put an end to the government for a variety of reasons. So they will signify to the president that his work has come to an end.
Let's talk about some of those push factors, right? So what are some of the causes of a coup? We have a story that we're carrying for our viewers this afternoon of Sudan, where people are going to the military and saying, save us.
Yes, there are a number of factors. There are structural elements and there are circumstantial elements. In terms of structural factors pushing the coup, we have the inheritance of colonial powers, where military establishments remain the most organized and perhaps the most structured institution, and that we inherit from colonization. And the colonial administration used military power, if not violence, to define the configuration of power, in fact to impose power. And the post-independent leaders also found it necessary to base their rulership on violence, the use of the military. So it became a game where political actors, whether they are civilians or military, use the military to remain in power, and the military themselves use the structure of the army to stay in power. That's one. The second factor is related to the absence of a democratization process. You will agree with me that many countries from the 60s upwards were less inclined in establishing a vibrant democracy where opposition parties, civil society, media, independent justice strive. These were absent in the political landscape. So the only alternative for people or for presidents to come to power was through coup or civil wars, and we can give many examples. I think if you look at a country like Central African Republic, or a country like Nigeria, at least until 1999, or a country like Benin, each of those countries experienced at least 5 coups as a way of transferring power. So the peaceful transfer of power remained extremely difficult. So when they realized that the president is not governing, that ethnicity is rife, that community differences are exploited or used, and poverty and unemployment gain momentum in the country, this provides excuse for co-leaders to plan and execute their strategy. And if you look at it also, the speech they made remained almost the same. I always believe that they copy each other because they said, given the circumstances and the poverty and the absence of freedom, we stage this coup to give back the country to the citizen, restore democracy and justice. Until the next coup, where we realize that all of those ingredients remain pipe dream.
Dr. Zounmenou, you mentioned the interference of outside forces, Western forces to be particular. In present-day Africa, in the attempts that we see, whether successful or not, in terms of coups, just how prevalent is that interference in modern-day Africa?
Well, if we look at the trajectory of coups between the 60s, let's say 1951, where we experienced the first coup in Egypt, to the latest coup in Guinea, outside interference has been prominent, at least until recently. Almost all of the coups that took place in Central African Republic were supported and sponsored by the former colonial power, France, for example, because they are the ones to decide who rules the country and who has to stay outside. The coup in Togo, for example, that toppled the first president of Togo, Sylvanus Olympio, was also accepted. The killing of the assassination of Thomas Sankara on the 15th of October 1987 benefited also from external support. So the external factor was a very important element in understanding the frequency of coups. Just because the leader is accused of belonging to the liberal or the leftist wing according to the prevailing ideology at that time. Currently, we can say that the external influence has reduced, remained prominent, but has reduced due to the fact that the democratization process has facilitated the emergence of civil society activists. Very keen to see or to promote some level of control over their government. We've seen also some level of justice. That reduces the capacity of external powers to decide who remains the president of the country. But they also create a different subtle way of influencing the political trajectory. But most importantly, the factor that we need to take into consideration was the decision by the Africans themselves through the African Union or the Organization of African Unity to do something about the regularity of the frequency of coups to give a chance for democracy to mature.
Sudan has had the highest number of military coups since 1952, and we find that West Africa in particular tends to have a lot of coups, right? So you've got a regional body like ECOWAS, which really does phenomenal work. We have to give it to them. You mentioned the African Union. I mean, there has been such harsh criticism against it for being reactionary instead of proactive. How do we better capacitate the African Union and also the African Court of Justice and Human Rights? What role can it play here in dissuading, military powers from taking over unlawfully?
That's a very interesting question. Sudan experienced at least 15 coups in its history. And also that's linked to what I was saying earlier, that these are countries where peaceful transfer of power through democratic means are practically impossible. So the coups or civil wars are the only alternative available for the change of power. You're right when you mentioned the wonderful work done by the African Union of the regional economic communities like the Economic Community of West African States. It's very important to highlight the impressive normative framework that they put in place and see the impact it has on coups. If you look at the number of coups that we have on the continent, until the 80s, early 90s, we were having at least 25 coups within that period. And by the time African Union decided to take action through the 2000 Lomé Declaration against coups, we've seen a sharp decline in coups from 25 to 15 and probably to 5. This year we experienced 3. But the question remains about the capacity of African Union, because it's not only about the Lomé Declaration. The Constitutive Act of the African Union also very adamant in fighting coups, but not only coups, but also for those leaders who are democratically elected, but who manipulated their constitutions, changed the constitution to remain in power forever. And there are many cases on this continent. So the question is for African Union and the regional economic communities to be effective, they need to take into considerations some of those elements that led to the coups, even under the democratic umbrella, where leaders can deliberately decide to flout democratic principles, to stifle human rights or democratic principles, send journalists to prison, or create instability, local instability that provides opportunities for military to take over. So those factors need to be taken into consideration. It's always important to sanction the coup leaders, to exclude them from the African Union organs, but it's also very much important to take into consideration and reprimand and sanction leaders that are violating human rights and also compromising the democratic consensus in any country. That's why it's very important to put more emphasis on the prevention rather than resolution of a situation, because that also affects the credibility of what ECOWAS or AU is standing for.
Dr. Zounmenou, in closing up the conversation, I would like to talk about whether democracy works for the continent or not, but perhaps just for the sake of time, if you were following developments where South Africa is concerned, just last week we saw the Minister of Defense being held hostage by some military veterans in the country. When we look at the DNA of coups, by no stretch of the imagination am I suggesting that this was a coup, but when you look at the DNA of coups, what do you make of the situation that happened in this country last week?
I think South Africa is an effective democracy. The institutions are functioning very well. You can always count on the independence of justice to seek a redress for your grievances. South Africa is also an effective state. I think when we talk about effective state, we talk about leaders who are willing, but who are also able to respond to the need of their citizens. And South Africa is a country where you have avenues to channel protests or to channel disagreements whenever there is. Mind you, South Africa on the continent is a country that experienced the highest number of protests globally. If you look at the data collected on the protests on this country. So it tells you that public freedom is very important, is well respected. What happened last year, I don't think I have any particular comment on that. It's very internal. But I think if there is a way to air grievances, taking ministers hostages is not the best approach to it.
Dr. David Zounmenou, Senior Research Consultant at the Institute for Security Studies. A great pleasure being in conversation with you this afternoon. Thank you.